Across the world, we're watching world wars break out, we're watching governments go bankrupt, we're watching governments print trillions of dollars, which is of course causing the 50-year high inflation we're seeing manifest itself all around the world today. And then in response to all of this madness, we're watching protests and political unrest and outright revolution start because the people have had enough, okay? Everybody around the world knows something seriously is wrong with our world. Everybody can kind of feel that things are changing very rapidly, but nobody knows what's causing it. So in today's video, I'm going to be breaking down what I think is causing a lot of the madness we see manifest itself today in what I like to call clown world, because I think it's obviously due to many of the transformative cycles that are currently unwinding today in the 2020s. Okay, it's very, very rare that we get the opportunity to live through the conclusion or the unwinding of an 80-year long-term debt cycle or a 90-year political upheaval cycle, and it's even more rare that we get the chance to live through the conclusion of a 250-year revolutionary cycle or a 250-year empire cycle. But guess what? Guess what's even rarer than any of that? Living through the conclusion of all of the above, because that is what we are witnessing today in the 2020s. We are watching the convergence of many of these very transformative cycles that are all unwinding today simultaneously. So it goes without saying, I think the next 5 years are probably going to be the most consequential years in human history. And whenever there's significant change, there is also great opportunity. So I'm going to outline to you guys today why I believe the next 5 years could be the largest wealth transfer in human history. So I think today is the time to start paying attention to what's going on around the world and actually turn a lot of the madness and the change we see around the world into an opportunity. So let's get straight on into this video explaining to you guys what I think is causing clown world and how you guys can take the advantage of the opportunity we are seeing. Welcome back to the Fix the Money, Fix the World YouTube channel. If you are new here, my name is Luke and I make videos on macroeconomics, geopolitics, and explaining why our clown world is so crazy. Everybody sees it, everybody knows it, but nobody knows what's causing it. So in today's video, we're going to be touching on what is causing clown world, and I'm going to be explaining what I think the Bitcoin standard is going to look like, and most importantly, why most people are not prepared for the transition that I think we're going to take to hyper-Bitcoinization. Lots of people talk about this Bitcoin standard, hyper-Bitcoinization, and in this video, I'm going to be outlining why I think the path to the Bitcoin standard will be more volatile than most people expect. So let's get straight on into this video, who is brought to you by my three amazing show sponsors, Hodling Apparel, the BitBox02 Hardware Wallet, and of course the Bitcoin Day Conference. We will hear more from the sponsors later on in today's video. We are living through such a revolutionary time that I think a lot of people don't quite appreciate. It's very rare that any of us get to live through the conclusion of, say, a 90-year fourth turning cycle or an 80-year long-term debt cycle, and it's very, very, very rare that any of us get the chance to live through a 250-year revolutionary cycle, okay? And basically, it all comes down to simple mathematics. We only live for 90 years' time, so we rarely get to experience what one of these unwindings to a cycle feels like. But I think, as you can see on screen today, we are living through a very interesting time because all of these cycles on screen are unwinding right now together, okay? They are converging here in the 2020s, and I think that is responsible for a lot of the madness we see in the world today. So we have 5 cycles on there: revolutionary, a fourth turning, a technological, an empire, and an economic cycle. But then most importantly, there's something else that a lot of people are not talking about, and that is the transition into the digital age. The transition into the digital age is probably the most important thing, okay? It is not just a cycle, it is a once in a species event where we immerse ourselves in technology, and the transition can take two very divergent and diametrically opposing paths. We either retain self-sovereignty and freedom in the digital age, or we live in a digital panopticon, and that is kind of the thesis or something that's touched on in a book called The Sovereign Individual, which we will be covering towards the end of today's video. But today I want to firstly start by kind of explaining and highlighting what is going on in the world, okay? So obviously all of these cycles are converging and unwinding today in the 2020s, and I feel as if 2020 was the inflection point that really unmasked all of that, okay? These cycles have been slowly unwinding over the past decade, okay? We have been slowly approaching a climax, but 2020 was the massive kind of inflection point that ripped the veil off and made it very apparent to lots of people around the world that something is seriously messed up, okay? Something wild is going on around the world, and you kind of see that manifest itself in clown world, okay? People are literally losing their minds as they're not able to deal with this rapid change that our world is undergoing, okay? The world has never been changing at such a rate, okay? You're watching people go mad, okay? We're being told that health ministers should look like that. People are wrapping themselves in bubble wrap. Boys think they're girls. We're being told that girls should be boys. We're obviously watching mainstream media outlets spew propaganda upon us. We're watching people literally wear 3 masks and wear rubber gloves in a car driving alone. It is absolutely madness. Some of the things on screen that are evident in clown world I cannot talk about here on YouTube because I will be silenced, just like Joe Rogan was on Spotify for simply talking about a psychological condition called a mass formation psychosis, okay? That term was a little bit unknown before 2021, but 2 doctors, Dr. Robert Malone and Dr. Matthias Desmet, kind of popularized that term, okay? And it just essentially describes how a society collectively loses its mind, okay? And we have seen this throughout history many times. The most kind of famous example of a collective hallucination is obviously the German people losing their minds, which led to the extermination of many Jews back in the 1930s and the rise of Hitler. But anyone who talks about clown world or this mass formation psychosis, or dare I say the medical industry, they get absolutely silenced. And it's pretty wild that we have an actual disinformation board in the United States, okay? The country that was founded on free speech tried to push through a version of George Orwell's Ministry of Truth, okay? And obviously this is a great comparison to the book 1984, and it's pretty scary how that book has essentially been turned into a blueprint for dictators all around the world in this rising global digital authoritarianism. And Orwell would be shocked at the state of clown world in 2022. But you know, what's causing it? Most people around the world kind of now are beginning to understand that something's messed up. You see all of these groups popping up around the world, like the Great Awakening, the Spiritual Awakening. People know that something is happening and something fundamentally is changing. And obviously, I'm talking to a group of Bitcoiners. We all know that the money is kind of destroyed and it is breaking at a rapid rate. Okay, obviously, when you corrupt the money, you corrupt the minds of society. We all know that. But I think the other things that are being missed, it's not just the corruption and the death of fiat money. We have seen the collapse of fiat currencies hundreds of times throughout history. Some people even say 750 times we've seen the collapse of fiat money. But we are living through the conclusion and unwinding of many of these transformative and revolutionary cycles that always bring such chaos and such change when they do unwind. So in today's little presentation, we're going to be going back through the history books very briefly. I don't want to bore you guys too much, but we're going to look at what happens when each of these cycles unwinds. And I'm going to kind of give you guys my thoughts on what's going to happen in the 2020s as we're watching this convergence of all of these cycles unwind together. Okay, here's another good chart from my good friend and actual boss, Mark Moss, who's also done some good work on 3 of these cycles. He's kind of looking at the convergence of the political, financial, and technological cycles. So you can kind of see here by this chart, each of these cycles operate on different time frames. So the big blue one is a 250-year political revolution cycle, and we only go through the unwindings of these very rarely. But then in yellow, you have the financial cycle, which is an 80-year time frame. And then the red cycle is kind of showing that the 50-year technological cycle again operates on a different time frame. And it's very interesting that we're watching the convergence of all of these cycles changing our world right now today in the 2020s. And we are creatures of habits, okay? We are human beings and we try to resist change as much as we possibly can. But essentially, I think we're going to live for a very, very consequential handful of years here, okay? This quote from Lenin kind of sums up how I think the 2020s are going to unfold. There are decades where nothing happens, and then there are weeks where decades happen, okay? And the primary reason why I do think the 2020s will be probably the most consequential decade in human history is because the money has never been more fucked today than it has been in human history, okay? That is why we're looking at interest rates being at a 5,000 year low, because the money is more broken than it has been in 5,000 years. So this brings me to talking about the first cycle I want to discuss with you guys today, and that is the 80-year long-term debt cycle. And this is a great cycle that was kind of created and popularized by a great economist called Ray Dalio. And Dalio simply looked back upon many economic booms and busts throughout history, and he noticed a very similar reoccurring trend, and that is you go through these 50 years of debt leveraging where you continue to create more and more debt in the economy, but then whenever you leverage the system beyond its natural means, you always go through a deleveraging process. And the only question is, do you go through an inflationary deleveraging or do you go through a deflationary deleveraging like what we saw in the 1930s in the Great Depression? That is a deflationary deleveraging. Prices crash, they deleverage themselves as the debt gets liquidated. The other option, which governments actually prefer to use when they do need to deleverage their own balance sheets, is they choose to deleverage their balance sheets through an inflationary process. Okay, now what's that? It's a little bit different. When you go through an inflationary deleveraging, what you're doing is you're creating inflation, okay? You're printing money, devaluing money, and you're paying back the enormous debt with the devalued dollars. Except instead of asset prices crashing like they do in a deflationary deleveraging, asset prices actually go up in nominal terms when you price the assets in the inflationary currency, okay? And this happens every single time that you reach unsustainable debt levels within an economy or a government. So why do we need to go for a mass deleveraging event? I get this question a lot. Why? Well, it's simple mathematics. And that kind of unsustainable figure looks to be around 130% debt to GDP. Okay, so this brings me to an amazing study that was done by Hirschman Capital in 2020. They looked at 52 different countries who've reached this 130% debt to GDP ratio, and they kind of this study looks at the past 250 years of economic history, and they showed that 51 out of 52 of those countries who have reached that 130% debt to GDP ratio have defaulted on their debt. Okay, it's straight out, it's as simple as that. 51 out of 52, so 98.5% probability that you're going to default on our debt. So where are we today? Well, the United States hit that Rubicon in 2021. We hit 139% debt to GDP, so a lot of people are saying, hey, look, we're probably going to default in the next 15 years. But interestingly, it's not just the United States this time. At the conclusion of this long-term debt cycle, it's everyone around the world, okay? Japan, Sudan, obviously a lot of these European countries are absolutely up shit creek without a paddle. So how do we get out of it? What are the potential ways to get out of it? How do governments default on this debt? Okay, there's 4 ways out of unsustainable debt. You either go through austerity, like what was forced onto the Greek people 10 years ago in the European debt crisis, and you can see by the protests they didn't like that, okay? Nobody likes austerity, okay? Nobody likes to balance the budget. It's not politically palatable in politics to balance the budget, okay? It leads to a slower economy, less jobs, recession, and it brings you back to reality. People don't like reality. We live in a clown world, okay? People want to live in this debt binge, debt gorging society, but anyway, that's your first option, austerity. Not very politically palatable, so it rarely gets chosen. Outright default also is very rarely chosen. Restructuring, rarely chosen. The most politically palatable and easiest option to deal with 130% debt Rubicon is straight out default through inflation, okay? And that is what most governments choose to do when they have a magic money printer. It's very easy. When you have a magic money printer, all you can do is simply print money, okay, devalue the money, and you pay back the enormous 130% debt with the devalued dollars. So very interestingly, our central planners have actually they're aware of this problem, okay? So there was an economic paper written in 2011, which later got published on the IMF website in 2015, titled The Liquidation of Government Debt, that pointed to this massive debt burden that the world and the United States is facing. And then there was another, obviously, economic blueprint, as I like to call them, that was written by BlackRock, another one of our favorite central planners, written in August 2019, titled Dealing with the Next Downturn. Now, essentially, the TLDR of both of these very long 50-page economic papers was we're gonna do exactly what the US did in the 1940s at the conclusion of the previous long-term debt cycle. Okay, when you reach the unsustainable debt levels and interest rates at zero, you've only really got one option, and that's inflate away the debt. And that's exactly what the US did in the 1940s. They used yield curve control to pin interest rates artificially low, and they let inflation run hot, averaging around 10% for the years between 1945 and 1952. So naturally, that decreased the US's government debt from 120% to around 60% in the space of 10 years. Okay, so that's what we talk about where we're talking about inflating away the debt. And obviously, who got hurt the most? The citizens, the everyday people got hurt the most, okay? Obviously, FDR passed Executive Order 6102 in 1933 from memory. And then obviously just a couple of years later, he revalued gold 40% higher after he'd stolen everybody's gold. So there wasn't a store of value there for the people to use during that financial repression, okay? They didn't have the technology available for them to use to actually protect themselves from the tyrannical governments, because obviously bankrupt governments are tyrannical governments. I always talk about this. Yes, we all know what Satoshi's birthday is and the significance that will have on 6102. We're going to talk about that later. But look, we've got more debt today than we did in the 1940s, and it looks as if central banks are beginning to kind of enter the early stages of this playbook. It looks as if they want to inflate away the debt. You can see German PPI, producer price inflation's 33%. Spain PPI is in the 40%. Okay, and we actually have over 30 countries now have official CPI inflation over 15%. Okay, that's massive. And obviously we all know official CPI is a scam. We're going to do a whole video breaking that down. But so naturally central banks have to kind of pretend that they're going to do something to fight this 50-year record-breaking inflation. So they're pretending to raise interest rates. And a lot of people are saying this will normalize inflation. Inflation's coming down. I don't think that's the case. But I do think we're going to see a decade of structurally high average inflation. So you can see in the 1940s and the 1970s, the previous 2 decades where we actually had significant inflation in the official government CPI basket, you can see it wasn't a straight line. So you had lots of disinflationary spikes during those periods, okay? Inflation didn't just go up to 10% and stay there for 10 years. It went up to 15, crashed back down to 2 as central banks tried to fight inflation. Went up to 20, crashed back down to 3. And I also think we're in the beginnings of a commodity super cycle. So a lot of people say commodities have topped. I don't think so. I think you're going to see a decade where inflation is structurally higher, commodities are structurally higher, and it's all got to do because we're reaching the very conclusion of this 80-year long-term debt cycle. And what you see at the conclusion of these long-term debt cycles is more volatility. So each stock market crash is becoming more and more volatile. The 2020 crash was more volatile than 1929 and 1987, and they're becoming more frequent the closer you get towards the end point. So that is obviously what this interesting chart on the left here shows. That is the Phugoid cycle, and that's kind of an aeronautical engineering terms, and it just kind of shows that the closer you get towards a mechanical catastrophe, the more volatile the oscillations get in that broken system. And that's what we're watching. The volatile contractions, if you will, of the economy are getting larger each time the economy contracts, and they're getting closer and closer together. So our previous recession was 2008. Then we lasted 11 years until the 2019 repo market blow up. And now we've got a recession only 3 years later. So I think, how does this 80-year long-term debt cycle conclude? Prepare for volatility. Okay, it won't be a straight line to hyperinflation. I am not saying we're going to get hyperinflation. I think I personally think most countries around the world will, but it won't be a straight line to the inevitable conclusion of a new monetary system, which I think we're going to get to before the end of 2030, just because lots of these hyperinflationary events or currency collapses, they follow this same trend. They get more volatile the closer you get towards the end. So that's what I think we're going to see. We're going to see currency collapses. We're going to see lots of calls for reforms. The people are going to get fed up with the high inflation. They're going to call for new institutions like they did at the previous long-term debt cycles in the 30s and the 40s. That was obviously where we saw the creation of lots of new institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, etc. And I think something else you see is changes of global reserve currencies. Okay, now this gets us into our next cycle, the 250-year empire cycle. So this is, again, another thesis being put forward by Ray Dalio. So Dalio popularized the idea of a long-term debt cycle in one of his books called Big Debt Crises, but he also popularized the idea of a 250-year empire cycle. So in his book that was released in November 2021, he essentially just looked at many of the great empires over the past 500 years, and he showed, hey, they all go through this 250-year cycle, and typically they would actually begin to decline or reach the conclusion of their dominance, their world dominance, when their economic system starts breaking down. So typically when the global empire reaches the end of an 80-year long-term debt cycle and an economic bubble, that's typically where the empire also starts to decline. So you can kind of see each of the great empires we've had over the past 400 to 500 years, whether it was the Spanish Empire, the Dutch Empire, the French, the British, or the American Empire, they all are kind of looking as if they're going to decline when their economics bubble begins to burst. And Dalio posits when an empire begins to decline, a rising empire always tries to challenge the declining empire. So in his book, Dalio says the US empire is declining, and he thinks that we're going to see the rise of a Chinese empire. I could do another hour-long talk about why I'm very bearish on China, but I don't think they're going to be the rising empire. But that's kind of why you're seeing China engage in lots of partnerships with lots of these BRICS countries around the world. I actually did a 20-minute video on BRICS just the other day. I'll put the link to that video on the screen right now, and we kind of broke down how they're talking about creating a new reserve currency with these BRICS nations. So that's very interesting. Something else you see at the conclusion of these 250-year empire cycles is wars typically break out between the declining empire and the rising empire, and that is when the reserve currency typically changes. So you see lots of external wars, you see internal conflict and cultural decay at the end of these empire cycles, and history doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. So the empire cycle reminds me a lot of this kind of fourth turning cycle. So the fourth turning is obviously a book written by Strauss and Howe back in the 1990s, and they predicted that, hey, guess what? In the 2020s, you're going to see significant political unrest, you're going to watch governments collapsing, you're going to watch a period of chaos. A 22-year period of chaos was the hypothesis they made. And they essentially made this hypothesis based upon the past 500 years of history. They just simply observed, hey look, every 90 years, the world seems to go through significant revolution and political upheaval. So on the screen here, I have a few of these cycles. You can see in the 1770s, we saw the American and the French Revolution. 90 years later, we saw the Mexican War and the American Civil War. 90 years later, we saw World War II, the rise of Hitler, FDR's New Deal, obviously Mussolini in Italy. We saw lots of populist uprisings and change, and 90 years forward takes us to a certain period of time. Once again, we're seeing significant change and political unrest and populist movements all around the world. And the reason for that, due to the authors, they believe it has something to do with generational theory. Okay, so they essentially say that it's all dependent upon the cultural mood present in a society. Okay, so I don't have time to break down the entire 90-year fourth turning cycle, but we've all heard the kind of saying, hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and then weak men create hard times. Okay, so naturally the kind of really TLDR version of this thesis is the good times create the weak men. So after the previous 90-year fourth turning, we had the end of World War II. We had a lot of change in the 30s and 40s. People were sick of all the chaos, and we agreed to kind of settle down, end World War II, enter a period of peace, or a good times, if you will. And the people who grow up in the good times and they don't understand how hard you have to fight for freedom, peace, and liberty, they get very complacent, and then that kind of feeling of complacency, it permeates society, and people begin to become weak, and then obviously weak people create hard times. Okay, so it all goes back to generations are shaped by history, but history is then shaped by those generations. So we are very influenced by the times that we grow up in, or the times that we live through. Okay, that's a very TLDR version of how the fourth turning works. I recommend you read the book, but we can see today's fourth turning. After the 2008 global financial crisis, we've seen a massive rise in protests all around the world. I love this little chart here on the right. You can see the number of protests around the world was going parabolic between 2016, 17, 18, and 2019. The number of protests nearly doubled the amount of protests that occurred in 2018. Remember, what happened in 2020 that stopped all these protests and political upheavals and unrests? I won't go into that here on YouTube, but you guys know what happened. So obviously, 2019 was actually known as the year of the protests. So I think there was like 10 countries with over 1 million protesters in them. Okay, so what do you see at the end of fourth turnings? They typically end in war, chaos, and really extreme circumstances. And this is just another cycle unwinding today in the 2020s. So far we've covered the 90-year fourth turning cycle, 250-year empire cycle. You could say we touched on the 90-year global reserve currency cycle, and we touched on the 80-year long-term debt cycle. They are all unwinding today in the 2020s. Now, before I kind of wrap this video up and we get into the other cycles, I want to quickly hit on today's show sponsors. Massive thank you to today's show sponsor, Hodling Apparel, who is the best Bitcoin and freedom-oriented clothing brand in the space. Trust me, guys, I've been in the Bitcoin space for around 5 years now, and it's very, very difficult to find some high-quality Bitcoin clothing. And like me, the two founders of Hodling Apparel were endlessly looking for more wearable, everyday Bitcoin clothing until they realized they could just make their own, and that's exactly what they've done. As you can see on the screen here, guys, they offer a wide range of hats, t-shirts, and sweatshirts for every type of Bitcoiner, male and female, whether they are loud maximalists or low-key sovereign individuals. So whether you're headed to the next Bitcoin conference or family reunion, get yourself some gear at hodlingapparel.com to spread the Bitcoin message in style. Today, guys, you can get 20% off the entire range at Hodling Apparel if you use the promo code BMS20. So that is BMS20. That stands for Bitcoin Made Simple. And you guys can also get 15% off if it's your first time buying anything at Hodling Apparel. I highly recommend you go and check them out. My personal favorite is the Ungovernable t-shirt. I've got one of those on the way and I'll be sporting it very shortly. But massive thank you to, again, Hodling Apparel. Check them out at hodlingapparel.com. So I hope I'm beginning to illustrate that we are living through some pretty chaotic times, okay? We're living through the convergence and the unwindings of many of these transformative and revolutionary cycles. But this video has been going for a little bit long already, so maybe in the next video I might split this up into a part 1 and the part 2. And in the next video we're going to cover the 50-year technological cycle, also known as the Kondratiev wave or the long K cycle. We're also going to talk about the most important transition, which is the transition into the digital age. And then as we start talking about technology, I want to compare Bitcoin, the emergent monetary technology, to the adoption of many other transformative technologies that we've seen being adopted by everyone around the world throughout history. So obviously, very interestingly, all technologies get adopted in an exponential wave, also known as like an S-curve adoption wave. And in the next video, I'm going to be showing you where we are on that S-curve, because I think we're very close to an inflection point where a lot of people are going to be surprised at how rapidly the other 99% of the world figures out the importance of Bitcoin. And I think it all happens before the year 2030 comes, okay? So if that interests you, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because that will notify you when I drop part 2 of this little video series. If you like this video, feel free to like. If you want to make any comments, or you want to tell me I'm boring, or if you want to tell me to focus on a cycle more, leave me a comment down below and let me know what you guys thought. But I'm going to leave this one here, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.